Robert Berrio. Welcome to my electric bike channel. I often meet people who ask me the question, how far can you go on a full charge with an electric bike? They usually ask me the question just out of curiosity. But that's an important question if you're planning on buying a new electric bike or if you're planning on going on a long road trip. So today, I'll try to answer the question, what's the range of an electric bike?
There's no simple answer to calculating the range of an electric bicycle because so many different factors and conditions affect the amount of energy it takes to move the bike and its load. The purpose of this presentation is to look at those factors and conditions and to provide a tool for calculating the range. The first factor we will look at is battery capacity, the most important factor that influences range. The battery is the bicycle's gas tank. Instead of gasoline, the battery holds a given amount of electrical energy. The bigger the battery, the more energy it can hold, the farther you can go on a charge. Manufacturers usually express their battery capacity in terms of volts and amp hours. For example, my Pedego e-bike has a 48 volt 15 amp hour battery, and my Bosch Cube works off a 36 volt 11 amp hour battery. But volts and amps are not a good way to compare different batteries because e-bikes are not all the same. Depending on the manufacturer or the model of e-bike, the motor could work off 24, 36, or 48 volts, or even more. And the battery might have anywhere from 4 amp hours to 21 amp hours. So, a common measure is needed. To achieve this, we convert volts and amp hours into a unit common to all batteries, the watt-hour. To convert volts and amp hours to watt-hours, multiply volts times amp hours. Take my 48 volt 15 amp hour Pedego as an example. To find out the equivalent in watt-hours, multiply 48 times 15, which gives 720 watt-hours. The watt-hour is a unit of energy equivalent to 1 watt of power expended over a period of 1 hour. I'll give you an example. If you leave a 100 watt light bulb on for 1 hour, you've used up 100 watt hours of energy. This leads to the question, what's a watt? A watt is a unit of electrical power. A watt is a small amount of energy, so small that it is only 1% of the power to run a 100 watt light bulb. You might be more familiar with the concept of horsepower. Since it takes 746 watts to produce 1 horsepower, 1 watt is a force equal to 1/746th of a horsepower. Each manufacturer offers different battery sizes. Pedego offers 4 different battery sizes for its e-bikes, from 360 to 720 watt hours. Other companies offer batteries as little as 110 watt hours for the Faraday Porter to as much as 1008 watt hours for juiced bikes. Some off-road bikes have even more powerful motors and bigger batteries yet. Further into this presentation, I will offer a tool for calculating range, and the calculations take into account the capacity of the battery. It's true that the size of the bike's battery, like the size of a car's gas tank, dictates how far you can go. But there are many other factors that influence range to various extents. Let's start with wind. If you're a cyclist, you know all too well that pedaling against a headwind takes more energy than riding with the wind in your back. It's worth noting that wind resistance increases with the square of the speed. In other words, if the wind is twice as fast, you're using 4 times more energy. For example, a 40-kilometer-hour wind doesn't cause twice as much resistance as a 20-kilometer-an-hour wind, but 4 times as much. In calculating the range, I'm assuming there is a light wind and we're doing a return trip against the wind in one direction and with the wind in the other direction. Related to wind speed is air resistance. Air resistance increases with speed but also depends on all the parts of the bike and the objects attached to the bike that obstruct the wind and cause drag. How large the rider is, the height and width of the bike, fenders, panniers, and so on. Even the position of the rider seated upright or bent over the handlebars can make a difference. In calculating range, we will be assuming the bike is fully equipped and the rider is seated vertically. The gradient of the road is important too. Are you riding on flat ground or are there lots of hills? Climbing up a steep hill is just as hard on the bicycle's motor as it is on your legs when you're climbing up a flight of stairs. Riding uphill takes a lot of energy out of the battery and that reduces the range. In calculating the range, we will assume that we're riding mostly on level ground with a few hills along the way. How much do you use the brakes? Stop-and-go traffic is bad on gas mileage for a car. So is it for an electric bike. Each time you stop, the kinetic energy of the bike is transferred to the brakes in the form of waste heat. Furthermore, speeding up to cruising speed from a dead stop sucks more energy than keeping a constant speed. You can save energy by coasting to a stop instead of using the brakes. When calculating the range, we'll be assuming that the bike only stops a few times per hour. How fast you accelerate from a dead stop or when you're coming out of a curve has an influence on your range. Jackrabbit starts are fun, but they waste a lot of energy. If you concentrate on accelerating slowly, you'll be using less power and you'll get more range. A very important factor is how hard do you want to pedal. Depending on the manufacturer, electric bikes offer from 1 to 5 different assistance levels numbered sequentially. The Bosch names its assistance levels Eco, Tour, Sport, and Turbo. When you begin pedaling, the motor kicks in and provides anywhere from 10% to 90% of the energy it takes to move the bike and its load, depending on the level of assistance you've selected. Most e-bikes sold in Canada and the USA have a throttle, which allows riding without pedaling at all, which means 100% assist. The more assistance you ask of your electric bike, the shorter the range. In calculating the range, we will be working on the assumption that the rider is providing 50% of the effort and the motor is providing the other half. How fast do you want to ride? How fast the bike is ridden is the most important factor under the rider's control in determining range, as you will see later. You'll see that the slower you go, the less energy it takes per kilometer or per mile. There are 3 reasons why speed affects your range. First is wind resistance. Even if there isn't any breeze at all, the bike creates its own wind, and the faster it goes, the more air resistance it creates. The second reason why the bike speed influences range is the difference between going slow and fast. When going slowly, the rider supplies proportionately more effort. When going very slow, like 15 kilometers an hour, you hardly need the motor at all. Whereas when going fast, the motor does most of the work. In calculating the range, we will be looking at 5 different speed levels. The third reason why the bike speed influences range is that the faster the bike goes, the faster the battery discharges. And batteries don't like being discharged rapidly. They will give you more power if they are drained slowly. Another factor that affects range is how much weight does your little motor have to deal with. It's obvious that a 100 kilogram man will demand more out of his bike than a 50-kilogram girlfriend. With him on the bike, there's more weight to bring up the cruising speed and to haul up the hills, and therefore he won't be able to go as far on a charge than his lightweight girlfriend. So we need to consider the gross weight, which is the combined weight of the bike, the battery, the cargo, and the rider. Weight is especially important in hilly territory. In calculating the range, we will be assuming that we're dealing with the weight of an average e-bike and an average person. Some of the characteristics inherent to an e-bike can influence its range. For example, the type of motor can have an effect on the range. Bicycles like the Bosch have a mid-drive motor located in the pedal crank. Bicycles like the Pedego have a hub motor which is placed in the center of the drive wheel. Mid-drives are generally more efficient than hub motors because they benefit from shifting the gears. Shifting gears on a bike with a hub motor offers no advantage to the motor. The hub motor always stays in direct drive. In calculating the range, we will be considering the more common hub motor. With bikes that have regenerative braking, each time the brakes are applied, about 55% of the kinetic energy is returned to the battery. With stop-and-go riding in the city, the advantage is very small, extending the range a bit depending on how often one has to stop. But in very mountainous areas, this might be a nice advantage. In calculating the range, we assume the bike doesn't have regenerative braking. The type of tire is important too. Fat, knobby tires create more friction than narrow, slick ones. Tires with butyl inner tubes tend to offer more resistance than those with latex inner tubes or no inner tube. In calculating the range, we will assume that we're dealing with mid-range tires. Old-fashioned incandescent lights can reduce your range, but the new LED lights draw so little power that you wouldn't notice any range difference. You might have a cell phone connected to a USB port on your controller, but that would have no measurable effect on your range. Any source of friction can affect range. Low tire pressure, badly adjusted brakes, a rubbing fender, dirty or rusty chain and gears, etc. In calculating range, we assume friction is kept to a minimum. As a lithium battery ages, it gradually loses the ability to accept a full charge from the charger. The result is that after 3 to 5 years, it can lose from 10 to 30% of its original capacity. Life of a battery is usually expressed as the number of full charges it can take, which can be 500 to 1,000 or even 2,000 charge cycles depending on the battery quality. After 3 years and 8,000 kilometers, my Pedego battery has had 261 partial charges and 7 full charges and still has most of its original capacity. In calculating the range, we will assume that the battery is like new. Although lithium-ion batteries are less affected by cold weather than lead-acid batteries, they do not perform as well in winter as they do in summer. In calculating the range, we will be considering only summer riding. This slide is important if you buy an e-bike with the purpose of traveling long distances per day, because you will need a lot more battery capacity than the average e-bike on the market has to offer. As mentioned before, the slower you discharge the battery, the farther the bike can go on a charge, because batteries like to be discharged slowly. At any given discharge rate, a big battery depletes slower than a small one, so it is able to give more energy in total than 2 small ones. Another advantage is that it would be less likely to suffer full discharges, which are bad for batteries. I've designed this power consumption table based on 3 seasons of riding my Pedego City Commuter. The power consumption table will give you a ballpark estimate of how many watt hours it takes to ride 1 kilometer or 1 mile depending on how fast you want to go, assuming you're providing 50% of the energy through pedaling. The left side of the table, the blue side, shows kilometers, and the right side, the orange side, shows miles. Each line shows a speed range and the average number of watt-hours per kilometer or per mile that you will consume at that speed. Columns 1 and 3 show 5 different speed levels. Column 2 shows watt-hours per kilometer, and column 4 shows watt-hours per mile. You'll notice that the watt-hours per kilometer or per mile increases exponentially as the bike goes faster. The faster you go, the greater the energy needed per kilometer or per mile. Let's look at line 5. Suppose you want to go full speed, which is 30 to 32 kilometers an hour with a road legal electric bike. Then, according to the power consumption table, you'd typically be using 12 watt-hours per kilometer or 19 watt-hours per mile. Now we turn to line 2. We decide to ride at a leisurely 21 kilometers an hour, which is between 20 and 22 on line 2. The power consumption table estimates that we'd be using only 8 watt-hours per kilometer or 13 watt-hours per mile. For the calculations in the following slides, we'll be working with 21 kilometers an hour and 8 watt-hours. Let's look at an example of how to calculate the range of a 720 watt-hour battery based on 21 kilometers an hour and 8 watt-hours per kilometer. It's just a matter of dividing 720 by 8. The quotient, 90, is the range in kilometers. Therefore, under normal circumstances, that bike should be able to cover about 90 kilometers before running out of juice. The other useful information we can derive from the power consumption table is how fast we're draining the battery. That is, how much electricity we're draining out of the battery per hour, or the capacity consumed per hour. Remember the meaning of 8 watt-hours. It means that for each kilometer traveled at 21 kilometers an hour, 8 watts of energy are being drawn from the battery over a period of 1 hour. If we use this example to calculate the capacity consumed per hour, we multiply 21 times 8, which comes to 168 watt-hours of capacity consumed per hour. In other words, every hour you'll have used up 168 watt-hours of the battery's capacity. This information now allows us to calculate how long the battery charge will last, or the running time. You could use the capacity consumed per hour from the previous slide to calculate how long you could ride on a charge. If, like my Pedego, your battery has a capacity of 720 watt-hours, simply divide the capacity by the capacity consumed per hour, 168, and that gives you the total running time, which is 4.3 hours. Now that we know how long the battery will last at 21 kilometers an hour, we have another way of estimating the range. According to our previous calculation, we can ride for 4.3 hours at 21 kilometers an hour. Simply multiplying the running time, 4.3, by the speed, 21, and the product is our range, 90 kilometers. What can we conclude from all this? Calculating the range of an electric bike is a difficult and imprecise science because so many variables come into play. In this presentation, I've offered the power consumption table as a rough guide to estimate the range of an average e-bike under average conditions. And before we finish, a caveat. You might have to modify the power consumption table to reflect the characteristics of your own electric bike and your own riding style. If you'd like to print off a copy of the power consumption table, you can find a printer-friendly version on my website, www.robertberrio.com.
I hope this presentation will be of help to you if you're shopping for an electric bike, or if you're planning to go on a long trip, or if it was just to fulfill your curiosity. On my website, there is more information that might be of interest to you, or subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching.